They called me dutiful. For 17 years I had maintained the Mortis archives, beneath the fortress monastery of the Crimson Consuls, cataloging the honored dead, preserving their legacies, ensuring that no warrior's sacrifice went unrecorded in the great ledgers of the chapter. My work was prayer. My precision was devotion. I believed that in documenting their deaths, I gave them immortality. I believed every word I transcribed was truth sanctified by their blood. My name is Hadrian Vex, third archivist of the Memoriam Crypts, and I want you to understand this before anything else. I was their accomplice long before I became their witness. The Mortis archives occupied the lowest levels of the fortress, 3 kilometers beneath the surface, where the stone wept moisture and the temperature held constant at 11 degrees. Cold enough to preserve parchment, cold enough to keep the servitors from degrading too quickly. I arrived each morning at the 7th hour as the matins bells finished their toll, descended the 2,347 steps, and passed through the copper doors engraved with the chapter's heraldry. The skulls that decorated those doors were not ornamental. They belonged to the first generation of archivists, men who had served so faithfully that even in death they guarded the threshold of memory. My desk occupied the central vault, surrounded by shelves that stretched 30 meters high into darkness. 17,000 individual scrolls, 43 bound chronicles, 9 centuries of recorded deaths. Each scroll bore the Imperial Aquila pressed in wax, each chronicle bound in leather tanned from the skin of penitent criminals. I had memorized the placement of every document, could retrieve any record within 3 minutes. This was not arrogance. This was my purpose, refined by repetition until it became reflex. The morning routine never varied. Light the brass candles, their flames reflecting off the polished skulls embedded in the walls. Unseal the preservation casket containing yesterday's work. Review pending transcription requests from the Reclusium, the Apothecarian, the chapter command. The air tasted of parchment and sanctified oil, the scent of preservation that meant my work endured beyond flesh and memory. I took pride in that permanence. The bodies of the fallen returned to dust, but my records granted them eternal presence in the chapter's consciousness. Most days passed in methodical transcription. A brother had fallen defending Hive Tertius against the Greenskin incursion. His body recovered with 15 wounds, none to his back. I recorded the coordinates of his death, the names of those who witnessed his final stand, the hymn they sang as his remains burned. The chaplain had verified every detail. The witnesses had given testimony under oath. The record entered the archive as truth absolute. One more thread in the tapestry of sacrifice that defined the Crimson Consuls, 900 years of service. I believed in that tapestry completely. I had been raised in the fortress monastery's scalam, selected at age 7 for archival training. Trained in the sacred duties of documentation for 9 years before I was permitted to touch an actual death scroll. My instructors taught me that memory was holy, that the emperor himself maintained the greatest archive in his throne room on distant Terra, that every human death was recorded in his infinite consciousness. We were merely imitating his perfection on a smaller scale. When I transcribed a warrior's death, I was not simply recording fact. I was performing a sacrament. The first wrongness appeared on a Terran Thursday in the 34th year of the 41st millennium. A servitor delivered a sealed case containing records from the purging of Gas Tertius, where the Crimson Consuls had suppressed a heretical uprising alongside inquisitorial forces. 17 brothers had fallen. The case contained their death scrolls for archival processing. Standard procedure. I broke the seal, expecting the usual documentation: battlefield coordinates, cause of death, witness statements, chaplain verification. The scrolls were identical in format to every other record I had processed. Parchment weight correct, wax seals unbroken, ink properly sanctified. But the witness section of 12 scrolls bore the same phrase in identical script, witnessed by those present. No names, no ranks, no signatures. Just that single phrase repeated across 12 separate documents supposedly prepared by different scribes in the heat of battle. I stared at those words until the candles burned low and the evening bells began their toll. I told myself there was an explanation. The battle had been chaotic. Perhaps the scribes had died before completing proper documentation. Perhaps the chaplain had authorized abbreviated records due to urgency of the campaign. Perhaps I was seeing patterns where none existed, finding significance in simple clerical error. I filed the scrolls according to protocol and mentioned nothing in my daily report to the chief archivist. But that night, lying in my cell, I could not silence the small voice, asking why 12 different scribes would use identical phrasing, identical script, identical spacing between words. The second incident came 3 weeks later. A request from the Ecclesiarchy for verification of a fallen brother's service record. Brother Matthias, who had died during the Gas Tertius Purge. The request was routine. The Ecclesiarchy wanted to confirm his deeds for inclusion in the Litany of Heroes. I retrieved his scroll from the recently filed Gast materials and cross-referenced it with his enlistment records, his campaign documentation, his progression through the scout company to full battle brother status. The dates did not align. According to the enlistment record, Brother Matthias had been inducted as a scout in the 28th year of the 41st millennium. Standard service progression suggested he would have achieved battle brother status approximately 5 years later, giving him roughly 1 year of full service before Gast Tertius. But the campaign records showed him as a veteran of 6 major engagements spanning 8 years, actions that predated his enlistment by 2 years. The mathematics made no sense. I checked the records 3 times. The enlistment date was clear. The campaign records were equally clear. Both could not be true. I examined the other Gas Tertius records. 4 more showed similar chronological impossibilities. Brothers who had supposedly fought in campaigns before their recruitment. Service histories that telescoped decades into years or stretched months into impossible spans. The errors were not dramatic. No one claimed a scout had fought at the Siege of Terra or that a brother had served for 3 centuries. The discrepancies were small, measured in years, not decades, the kind of error that would escape notice unless someone cross-referenced with obsessive precision. That night I did not sleep. I lay in my cell staring at the vaulted ceiling while my mind performed the calculations again and again, hoping to find the error in my analysis rather than in the sacred records. Perhaps I had retrieved the wrong enlistment file. Perhaps there were 2 Brother Matthiases, and I had confused their records. Perhaps the campaign dates used a different calendar system that I had failed to account for. But every rationalization crumbled under scrutiny. The files were correct. The dates were clear. The records contradicted each other. I decided to investigate quietly. Not to challenge the records, I told myself, but to understand them, to find the explanation that would restore my certainty. I had access to the entire Mortis archives. If there was an answer, it existed somewhere in those 17,000 scrolls and 43 chronicles. I would find it through diligent research, and when I understood the truth, my faith would be stronger for having survived doubt. I began with the most recent materials and worked backward chronologically. The Gast Tertius records were not unique. The further back I searched, the more inconsistencies I discovered. Battles that supposedly occurred simultaneously on worlds hundreds of light years apart. Brothers recorded as falling in combat who appeared again in later records. Casualty numbers that shifted between preliminary reports and final tallies, sometimes dramatically. None of it was blatant. No single error would raise alarm. But together they formed a pattern that could not be dismissed as simple clerical failure. I found the first explicit falsification on a Terran Saturday, 3 months after I had begun my investigation. The Chronicle of the Haldros Campaign, which documented the chapter's intervention in a planetary rebellion. The official record stated that the Crimson Consuls had arrived in response to a distress call from the planetary governor, who reported heretical contamination among the worker population. The chapter had performed surgical strikes against identified heretics, suffering minimal casualties while preserving the loyal population. A clean victory, a righteous intervention, the kind of action that exemplified the chapter's role as the Emperor's angels of death, buried in the archive's deepest shelves. I found a preliminary report filed by the expedition's epistolary. The handwriting was different from the official chronicle. The language was rawer, less refined. This was a field report, written in the immediate aftermath rather than the polished narrative prepared for archival preservation. It told a different story. The distress call had come from the governor, true, but the heresy he reported was workers organizing to protest starvation rations while the nobility hoarded food. The epistolary's report described finding no evidence of chaos taint, no sign of mutation or corruption, only starving people demanding justice from a governor who had embezzled the tithes, meant for their sustenance. The Crimson Consuls had killed them anyway, not surgically, not precisely. They had leveled 3 hive districts with orbital bombardment after the workers refused to disperse. 40,000 dead in the initial strikes, twice that in the collapse and fires that followed. The epistolary's report contained their names, or as many as could be recovered from census records. He had documented their deaths with the same meticulous care I applied to fallen battle brothers, as though their lives merited preservation in the great ledger, as though their deaths were worth remembering. The official chronicle contained none of this. The preliminary report had been filed, but never processed, never entered into the formal record, never acknowledged in the sanitized version that future generations would read as truth. The epistolary himself appeared in the casualty lists 2 years later, killed in action against Orc raiders. No mention of protest, no record of dissent, just another honored death, transcribed with the same formulas I had used 1,000 times. I sat at my desk with both documents spread before me, the polished chronicle and the raw field report, and understood that I was looking at murder documented as heroism, not the murder of enemies, not the necessary violence of war against chaos or Xenos threats, the murder of Imperial citizens whose only heresy was hunger. And someone had deliberately erased it from history, had rewritten the truth into something clean and noble and righteous. Someone had decided that these deaths did not merit honest recording, that the truth was less important than the narrative. The realization felt like falling, like discovering that the stone beneath my feet was painted canvas stretched over void. Everything I had believed about my work, about the sanctity of the archives, about the chapter's righteousness, rested on the assumption that the records were true, that when I preserved a death in the ledgers, I was honoring reality. But if the archives themselves were fiction, if the truth was routinely edited into acceptable shapes, then what had I been doing for 17 years? What were any of these carefully maintained records except elaborate lies? I wanted to stop there, to file the preliminary report back into obscurity and forget I had ever found it, to preserve my faith by choosing ignorance. But I could not. The doubt had entered my mind like poison in a water supply, spreading through every certainty I possessed. If this record was false, how many others were equally compromised? How much of the chapter's glorious history was simply skilled propaganda? And who had made these decisions? Who sat in judgment over truth, and determined which deaths merited honest documentation and which could be rewritten for convenience? I began examining records systematically, looking for the seams where truth had been sutured into fiction. The pattern became clearer with each document I reviewed. Campaigns against heretics that, in preliminary reports, had been strikes against rebellious populations, battles against chaos cultists that had actually been suppression of religious minorities who worshipped the emperor in unapproved ways, cleansings of corrupted hives that had been ordered because the planetary governor owed debts to chapter leadership. Again and again, I found the raw truth buried beneath official narrative, found the careful editing that transformed massacres into righteous victories. The numbers grew impossible to ignore. Over 9 centuries, I identified 47 major campaigns where preliminary reports contradicted official chronicles. 47 instances where the truth had been deliberately obscured. Conservative estimates suggested 2 million civilian deaths that had been either erased from the record entirely or reframed as necessary casualties in the war against genuine threats. 2 million people whose deaths I had helped legitimize through meticulous documentation of lies. 2 million souls who died not for the Imperium's survival, but for political convenience, economic advantage, or simple cruelty dressed in righteous language. I discovered the philosophical framework on a Terran Monday, buried in a text I had passed 1,000 times without reading. The Codex Delatari, shelved among tactical manuals and strategic treatises, bore no special marking to indicate its significance. I had assumed it was another combat manual, but the title meant the deleted code, and when I opened it, I found not tactical doctrine, but philosophical justification for everything I had discovered. The text was ancient, possibly pre-Imperial in origin, though it had been adapted with references to the Emperor and the Great Crusade. It argued that truth was not absolute but functional, that history was not record but tool, that documentation served not to preserve reality but to shape behavior. The Space Marines existed to protect humanity, the text reasoned, but humanity's faith in that protection was as important as the protection itself. If people believed the angels of death were infallible, they would remain loyal. If they saw the angels as fallible, as capable of error or corruption, faith would erode and the Imperium would fracture. Therefore, the text concluded, truth must be sacrificed to preserve belief. The archives must document not what happened, but what needed to be believed about what happened. Defeats must be reframed as victories. Mistakes must be erased. Atrocities must be justified or hidden. Not because the chapter was corrupt, the Codex insisted, but because humanity could not survive the truth. Fear and faith maintained order. Doubt invited chaos. Better to kill 2 million and preserve certainty than spare them and introduce uncertainty that might ultimately cost billions. The text included implementation guidance. Preliminary reports should be filed for internal verification, but never entered into permanent record. Witnesses who protested official narratives should be reassigned to hazardous duties where their eventual deaths would appear natural. Archivists who discovered inconsistencies should be monitored and, if necessary, silenced. The word used was not murdered. It was archived, as though problematic people could be filed away as easily as problematic documents. I read the entire text 3 times, not because I did not understand it the first time, but because I needed to confirm that I was not misinterpreting, not imposing meaning that was not present in the actual words. But the meaning was clear. This was not corruption of chapter doctrine. This was the doctrine, articulated with calm precision by whoever had authored this text centuries before my birth. The lying was not a failure. It was policy. The erasure was not a mistake. It was procedure. Everything I had discovered was not evidence of isolated moral collapse, but proof of systematic philosophical commitment to falsehood as a tool of governance. The worst part was that the logic was almost defensible. I could follow the reasoning. I could see how someone, faced with the actual horror of governing a galaxy where humanity teetered constantly on the edge of extinction, might conclude that truth was a luxury they could not afford. That faith maintained through deception was preferable to doubt that led to disintegration. That the deaths of 2 million innocents was acceptable, if it prevented the collapse of entire sectors. The Codex Delatari was written by someone who had thought deeply about these questions, who had wrestled with the moral calculus, who had concluded that the greater good required lesser evils performed with systematic efficiency. That was the true horror. Not that the chapter was led by monsters who delighted in cruelty, but that it was led by rational men who had determined that cruelty was necessary, who had created procedures and protocols for atrocity, who had built an entire apparatus of deception and convinced themselves it was righteous. The enemy was not ignorance or madness. It was sanity applied to an insane situation until the distinction between the two collapsed entirely. I found myself standing in my cell that night, staring at the small altar where I had performed morning prayers for 17 years. The icon of the Emperor, cast in bronze, his face serene and distant. I had prayed to him every morning, asking for the strength to honor the fallen through faithful documentation. I had believed he heard those prayers. I had believed my work served his divine plan. But what had I actually been doing? I had been legitimizing murder. I had been cementing lies into permanent record. I had been a skilled craftsman in the manufacture of false history. The personal loss came on a Terran Wednesday, 3 weeks after I discovered the Codex Delatari. My brother Thomas, who served as a medici orderly in the chapter's apothecarian, failed to report for morning duties. This was unusual. Thomas was meticulously punctual, the same trait that had made me successful in the archives. When he remained absent through midday, the chief apothecary requested archive verification of his service record. Standard procedure when personnel went missing. I retrieved his file and found it current and unremarkable. 14 years of faithful service. Exemplary performance reviews. Scheduled for promotion to senior orderly within the month. The file also contained a notation from the previous week. Thomas had been assigned to inventory duty in the bio-containment vaults, where the apothecarian stored samples from fallen brothers for genetic analysis and future recruitment screening. The vault had been locked for 3 days during his inventory. When it reopened, Thomas submitted a standard completion report, noting all samples accounted for, all preservation protocols maintained, no issues requiring command attention. I had worked in the archives long enough to recognize the signs. The unnecessary lockdown, the single-person assignment, the clean report filed immediately upon completion. These were the patterns that appeared before problematic personnel became archived. I checked the deployment rosters. A training exercise had been scheduled for that morning, a live-fire drill in the fortress monastery's lower combat ranges. Thomas had been assigned to the exercise as medical support, unusual for someone of his junior rank. The exercise commander was Captain Dravos, whose name appeared frequently in the implementation notes of the Codex Delatari. I descended to the combat ranges without authorization, my archive credentials granting me access to most fortress areas. The training exercise had concluded an hour earlier. The ranges were empty except for servitors clearing debris and sanitizing the firing positions. I found Thomas in the medicus station attached to the ranges. His body lay on an examination table, partially covered by a sheet. The left side of his skull had been destroyed by a bolter round fired at close range. The wound pattern was unmistakable. Not a training accident, not a ricochet or equipment malfunction. An execution performed with the precision that defined the Crimson Consuls in all their works. The preliminary report was still on the data slate beside his body. Captain Dravos had not yet filed the official version. I read it while standing in that cold room, the air thick with the scent of counterseptic and death. The report stated that Brother Medica Thomas Vex had been killed in a tragic training accident when a recruit's weapon discharged unexpectedly during a drill scenario. The recruit was being disciplined. Captain Dravos expressed deep regret for the loss of a promising young medica. Recommendations for improved safety protocols were appended. None of it was true. The weapon had not discharged accidentally. Recruits did not train with live ammunition in close quarters with medical personnel. The wound angle was wrong for the described scenario. This was murder documented as accident. The same editing process I had discovered in the archives, but applied to my brother's death while his body was still warm. Someone had killed Thomas and was already prepared with the official lie that would become permanent truth in the chapter's records. I checked his personal effects. His data slate contained notes from the vault inventory. He had discovered the same thing I had discovered in the archives. The biosamples contained genetic markers that contradicted official records about when and how certain brothers had died. Brothers supposedly killed in glorious combat showed signs of execution-style wounds. Brothers whose deaths had been attributed to enemy action had died from friendly fire. The genetic evidence told truth that the official records concealed. Thomas had documented his findings meticulously, had prepared a report for the chief apothecary. That report would never be filed. Thomas would be archived, transformed from troublesome truth-teller into tragic accident, his discoveries erased as thoroughly as the deaths he had tried to document. I stood in that Medicaid station for perhaps 30 minutes, looking at my brother's ruined face, understanding that this was the consequence of curiosity about truth in a system built on lies. This was what the Codex Delatari meant when it discussed archiving problematic personnel. This was the price of doubt, executed with the same cold efficiency that defined every aspect of chapter operations. Thomas had died not because he was a heretic or a traitor, but because he had seen truth and refused to pretend he had not. The rage came later, after the grief. Not hot rage that demanded immediate action, but cold rage that settled into my chest like permafrost. They had killed my brother. They had killed 2 million innocents across 9 centuries. They had killed truth itself, had murdered it systematically and documented the murder as righteous necessity. And they would continue killing, because the Codex Delatari had convinced them that killing was required. That faith could only be maintained through violence, that the Imperium's survival demanded an endless supply of small atrocities that somehow never added up to damnation. I requested an audience with the chief archivist 3 days after they burned Thomas's body. The audience was granted immediately. I understood why. They knew I had found my brother. They knew I had the archive access to uncover everything he had discovered. They were waiting to see whether I would accept the official narrative or whether I would require archiving. This was a test I had not requested but could not avoid. The chief archivist's sanctum occupied the highest level of the Mortis archives, a domed chamber where the wealthiest families in the subsector paid for private memorials to their fallen sons who had joined the chapter. Marble sculptures of warriors in heroic poses, bronze plaques listing names and battles, stained glass windows depicting legendary victories, all of it commemorating deaths that had probably been edited as thoroughly as everything else in the archives. The chief archivist himself sat behind a desk carved from a single piece of obsidian, his augmetic eyes clicking and whirring as they focused on me, servomotors grinding in their sockets. He did not pretend ignorance. "You found the preliminary reports," he said. Not a question. A statement that demonstrated he had been monitoring my movements through the archives, tracking which records I accessed, anticipating this conversation. "I found everything," I replied. "The Haldros campaign, the Gas Turchis inconsistencies, the Codex Delatari, my brother." He nodded, the gesture economical. "Then you understand the necessity. I understand that we murder innocents and call it righteous. We maintain faith," he corrected. "Faith that keeps 1,000 worlds loyal. Faith that prevents sector-wide collapse. Faith that allows humanity to survive another day in a galaxy designed to destroy it." His augmetic eyes locked onto mine. and I saw something flicker in their mechanical depths. Not malice, wariness. Do you think I have not questioned this? I have maintained these archives for 83 years. I have erased 40,000 truths. I have archived 17 archivists who discovered what you have discovered. Do you think I sleep peacefully? Then stop, I said. Tell the truth. Let the chapter face what it has become. He smiled, the expression carrying no humor. And then what? The chapter fractures. Loyalists war with reformers. Subsector Command loses confidence in our reliability. The Crimson Consuls are disbanded or absorbed into another chapter, losing 9 centuries of tactical doctrine and strategic positioning. The 17 worlds we defend are reassigned to overstretched forces that cannot provide adequate protection. Within a decade, 3 of those worlds fall to orc incursions. Within 2 decades, chaos finds purchase where faith has been replaced by doubt.
How many die in that scenario?
10 million, 50 million.
More.
You do not know that would happen. I do not know it would not happen. His hands trembled as he reached for a data slate on his desk. Not the tremor of age, though he was old. The tremor of exhaustion, of carrying weight for decades until the burden became physical. I have read every philosophical text in our archives. I have studied the history of chapters that pursued truth over faith. Most dissolved within 2 centuries. The galaxy is not designed for truth, Hadrian. It is designed to punish those who refuse necessary lies. He activated the data slate and turned it toward me. The screen showed a document I recognized immediately. My archive access logs. Every record I had reviewed in the past 3 months. Every inconsistency I had discovered. Every truth I had excavated from beneath official narrative. He had been tracking my investigation from the beginning, watching me move through the same revelations he had presumably experienced 8 decades earlier. You have a choice, he said. You can accept what the Codex Delatari teaches. You can recognize that truth is a luxury we cannot afford. You can continue your work here, preserving the necessary lies that maintain the faith that keeps humanity alive. Or, you can reject this wisdom. You can insist on your moral certainty, and you will be archived, as your brother was archived, as I will someday be archived when my doubts finally overwhelm my duty. That is not a choice. It is the only choice any of us have. Complicity or extinction. There is no third path. He leaned forward, and for a moment the wariness broke through entirely, showing me the man beneath the office. I do not enjoy this. I have not enjoyed a single day of my service for 60 years. But someone must be willing to carry this burden. Someone must be willing to maintain the machinery that preserves faith, even if that machinery grinds innocence into myth. I chose to be that person. Now you must choose whether to join me. I looked at him for a long moment, at his trembling hands, at his augmetic eyes that had seen too much and could not stop seeing, at the weight of 83 years of sanctioned atrocity pressing down on his shoulders until he bent beneath it. He was not a monster. He was a man who had been broken by impossible choices, who had decided that complicity was preferable to the alternative, who had convinced himself that his suffering somehow balanced the scales against the suffering he enabled. But his logic required accepting that faith mattered more than truth, that belief justified any atrocity, that humanity's survival depended on systematic lying enforced through systematic murder. It required accepting that 2 million deaths were unfortunate but necessary, that my brother's execution was tragic but justified, that the machinery of deception must continue grinding because stopping it might produce worse outcomes. It required becoming what he had become, carrying weight until it crushed me, performing evil while calling it good. I had discovered something in those 3 months of investigation. I had learned that faith, built on lies, was not faith at all, but fear dressed in ritual language. That loyalty maintained through deception was not loyalty, but coercion. That the Imperium, my brother, and I had served so faithfully, was not the righteous institution we had believed, but a system that consumed truth and excreted myth, that measured success in how effectively it could murder reality and replace it with convenient fiction. "I will not join you," I said. He closed his eyes. The gesture was not anger but resignation, the exhausted acceptance of someone who had known my answer before I spoke it. "Then you understand what happens next." "I understand. You could run," he said, opening his eyes. "Steal a shuttle. Reach a merchant vessel. Disappear into the Imperium's vastness. You would have perhaps 3 days before we found you, but those would be 3 days of life. And confirm everything the Codex Delatari teaches about truth requiring silence. That those who discover what we have discovered must be hunted like criminals." I shook my head. "No. If I am to be archived, let it be here. Let it be on record, buried however deep, that someone refused." He studied me with those clicking, whirring augmetic eyes. "Your refusal will not change anything. The machinery continues regardless of individual conscience. I know, but I will not be its oil." He touched a control on his desk, and I heard boots in the corridor outside. The guardians of the archives. The chapter serfs tasked with maintaining security in the Mortis crypts. They would take me to the combat ranges. They would file the preliminary report about a tragic training accident. They would transform me into acceptable narrative, editing my death as they had edited so many others. But they could not edit what I knew. They could not erase the truth from my mind before they erased my mind itself. The chief archivist stood as the guardians entered. "Your brother died well," he said quietly. "He maintained dignity until the end. You should know that. Did you watch?" I signed the authorization. I always watch. His hands trembled worse now, shaking so badly he had to grip the edge of his desk. "I owe the dead that much. To see what my choices cost. To carry their faces with the others." I understood then that this was his punishment. Not execution, which would have been mercy, but continuation. He would sign my death warrant and watch my death, and add my face to whatever gallery of ghosts he carried in his memory. He would continue serving, continue lying, continue archiving, until eventually someone archived him. The Codex Delatari had designed a perfect trap. Those who discovered the truth either died or became complicit. Complicity meant survival. Survival meant watching others die. Watching others die meant accumulating guilt that could never be resolved. The machinery ran on suffering, and the suffering was evenly distributed between the executed and the executioners. They took me to the combat ranges 30 minutes after midnight. The same ranges where they had killed Thomas. The same sanitized spaces where training accidents conveniently resolved problematic personnel. Captain Dravos was there, his face expressionless, his bolter already loaded. He did not speak. There was nothing to say. This was procedure, documented in the Codex Delatari, refined over centuries until it achieved perfect efficiency. I thought about many things in those final minutes. About the 17 years I had spent carefully documenting lies. About the 2 million dead whose true stories I would never tell. About my brother, who had tried to document truth and died for it. About the chief archivist, shaking behind his obsidian desk, condemned to watch death after death while maintaining the machinery that produced them. About the Imperium itself, vast and terrible, built on faith that required systematic murder of truth to maintain its coherence. I thought about what I should have done differently, whether I should have remained ignorant, whether I should have accepted the chief archivist's offer, whether 3 more days of life, purchased through running, would have been worth the confirmation that truth required silence. But those thoughts led nowhere useful. The choice had been made. I had refused to become oil for the machinery. Now the machinery would grind me down and document my destruction as unfortunate accident. Captain Dravos raised his bolter. His hand was steady. He had done this before many times. This was just another execution in service to faith maintenance. Just another truth that required archiving. just another small atrocity that the Codex Delatari promised would prevent larger ones. The logic was perfect. The execution would be clean. The official report was already prepared. Everything would continue exactly as it had before I discovered anything, and my death would change nothing except adding my name to the gallery of ghosts that haunted the chief archivist's memory. I am dead now. I have been dead for whatever length of time it takes a bolter round to cross 3 meters and destroy a human skull. My body has been processed through the Mortis archives, standard procedures. The preliminary report has been filed and replaced with official narrative. Tragic training accident. Promising young archivist. Recommendations for improved safety protocols. The machinery has transformed me from problem into myth, editing my death as it edited every death I helped document during 17 years of faithful service. But before Captain Dravos fired, I spoke the one thing they could not archive. I spoke truth aloud in a place dedicated to lies. I named the dead, not all of them. There was not time for 2 million names. But I named the ones I could remember. The workers of Haldros who died protesting starvation. The religious minorities purged for worshipping the Emperor in unapproved ways. The rebellious populations reframed as heretics. My brother Thomas, executed for discovering truth in biosamples. Every name was a small act of resistance against the machinery that demanded their silence. They could kill me. They could edit my death into acceptable narrative. They could maintain the Codex Delatari's perfect procedures. But they could not silence what I spoke in that moment. The words existed, however briefly. The truth had been articulated aloud, had disturbed the air, had traveled as sound waves through that sanitized space before the bolter round erased my capacity to speak further truth. The machinery could archive me, but it could not archive what I had already said. I do not know if this matters. I suspect it does not. The Crimson Consuls will continue lying. The archives will continue erasing. The Codex Delatari will guide operations for centuries more, training archivists in the art of sanctified deception, teaching them that faith requires murder, and that their complicity serves humanity's survival. The machinery will grind on regardless of individual conscience, regardless of small acts of resistance, regardless of whether one archivist chose dignity over continuation. But I chose anyway, not because I believed it would change anything, not because I thought my death would inspire revolution or reform, but because the alternative was becoming what the chief archivist had become, shaking and haunted, watching others die to maintain faith in lies, carrying guilt that could never be resolved because the machinery demanded continuous operation. I chose death because it preserved something the machinery could not edit. Not my life, which was forfeit the moment I refused complicity, but my conscience, which remained mine until the very end. If you are reading this, then somehow my words survived when I did not. Perhaps the chief archivist, in a moment of doubt, preserved this testimony instead of destroying it as procedure demanded. Perhaps another archivist discovered it decades or centuries after my death and chose to maintain it in violation of Codex Delatari protocols. Perhaps the machinery itself failed in some small way, allowing truth to persist in the cracks between official narratives. Or perhaps you are reading fiction. Perhaps the machinery successfully archived me, and this testimony is simply another convenient narrative. Truth dressed as lies dressed as truth, layers of deception so complex that distinguishing reality from fabrication becomes impossible. That uncertainty is itself part of the machinery's design. The Codex Delatari understood that the most effective lies are those that make truth indistinguishable from fiction. I cannot tell you how to resist the machinery. I do not know if resistance is possible or meaningful. I can only tell you what I chose when confronted with impossible options. I chose not to become oil. I chose to name the dead aloud, however briefly, before the machinery silenced me. I chose dignity over survival, conscience over continuation. Truth over the faith that truth supposedly threatens. Was this choice righteous? I do not know. The chief archivist would argue I chose selfish moral certainty over the greater good, that my death solved nothing, while my compliance might have spared future victims through careful internal reform, that by refusing to join the machinery, I abandoned any possibility of changing it from within. His logic is coherent. His position is defensible. He may be right, but I remember my brother's face, ruined by the bolter round that archived him. I remember the 2 million names I could never speak, because there was not time. I remember the Codex Delatari's calm articulation of systematic atrocity dressed as necessary wisdom. And I conclude that some machinery should not be oiled, that some faith should not be maintained, that some lies are worse than the doubt they supposedly prevent. The Imperium teaches that the Emperor protects, that faith in his divine plan justifies any sacrifice, that our suffering serves his grand design, that the machinery of governance, however terrible, ultimately preserves humanity against forces that would devour us entirely. Perhaps this is true. Perhaps the alternative to the Codex Delatari is not honest governance, but total collapse. Perhaps those who maintain the lies are heroes who bear unbearable burdens so that others may remain innocent. Or perhaps the machinery has convinced itself that atrocity is necessity, because accepting responsibility for atrocity as choice is psychologically unbearable. Perhaps the Codex Delatari exists not to preserve humanity, but to preserve the positions and privileges of those who govern humanity. Perhaps the faith that the machinery claims to protect is simply fear that has been ritualized into doctrine. I do not know. I will never know. The bolter round that archived me also archived my capacity to investigate further. But I know this: when the machinery demanded my complicity, I refused. When it offered survival in exchange for silence, I chose to speak. When it tried to transform my death into convenient fiction, I named the dead aloud so that truth existed, however briefly, before the machinery erased it. These choices may have been foolish. They may have been selfish. They may have accomplished nothing except satisfying my own need for moral certainty. But they were mine. The machinery could not take that from me. It could kill me, edit me, archive me, transform me into tragic training accident in official records. But it could not force me to become its willing component. That small victory, meaningless though it may be, is all I have to offer those who come after. Not a plan for resistance, not a strategy for reform, just the example of one person who, when faced with impossible choices, chose conscience over continuation. The Emperor protects, the priests teach. Perhaps he does. Perhaps he watches from his golden throne and judges our choices with infinite wisdom. Perhaps he counts the dead and weighs them against the living and determines whether the machinery's calculations justify its costs. Perhaps he sees my death and marks it as necessary sacrifice in some grand equation I cannot comprehend. Or perhaps he sees it and weeps, or does not see it at all, or does not exist except as the greatest lie the machinery ever told. I do not know. I believed once, with perfect faith, that he heard my prayers. I believed my work in the Mortis archives served his divine purpose. I believed the machinery was righteous because it claimed his authority. Those beliefs were edited as thoroughly as the records I maintained. Now, in these final moments, I believe only this: that truth matters more than faith in lies, that conscience matters more than survival through complicity, that naming the dead matters more than the machinery that demands their silence. This testimony is my archive, my record of what I discovered, what I chose, what price I paid for refusing to become oil. If it survives, then perhaps someone will read it and understand that the machinery can be refused, even at ultimate cost. If it does not survive, then I have lost nothing, because I was already dead the moment I discovered truth in a system built on lies. My name is Hadrian Vex. I was third archivist of the Memoriam crypts, fortress monastery of the Crimson Consuls for 17 years. I documented 17,000 deaths and discovered that most of them were lies. I found my brother's body and understood that his death was murder dressed as accident. I was offered complicity and refused it. I was offered survival and rejected it. I chose truth over faith, conscience over continuation, dignity over the machinery's demands. I am dead now. I have been dead since the moment I named the dead aloud in that sanitized combat range. But I died as myself, not as the machinery's component. I died with my conscience intact and my voice raised in witness, however briefly, against systematic atrocity dressed as necessary wisdom. That small thing, that tiny resistance, is all I have to offer against the vast machinery of Imperial lies. It may be nothing. It may change nothing. The machinery grinds on regardless of individual conscience. But it was mine, and they could not archive it until after I had spoken it aloud. That truth existed, for however many seconds it takes a bolt around to cross 3 meters. And perhaps that is enough, perhaps bearing witness, even knowing it accomplishes nothing, is the only dignity available to those who discover what I discovered. To you who read this, if anyone does, the machinery will offer you the same choice it offered me: complicity or archiving, lies or death. It will explain its logic with perfect rationality. It will show you the calculations that justify atrocity. It will convince you that faith must be maintained through violence, that doubt invites extinction, that small horrors prevent larger ones. The chief archivist's hands will shake as he explains this. His voice will carry wariness born of decades maintaining these lies. He will almost convince you that his suffering balances the scales. Do not believe him, or believe him if you must. Choose as your conscience demands. But understand that complicity and archiving are not the only options. There is a third path, invisible to the machinery because it cannot comprehend it. The path of bearing witness, of naming the dead, of speaking truth aloud before the machinery silences you, of refusing to become oil even when refusal means death. This path leads to no victory. It accomplishes nothing except preservation of conscience. It changes nothing in the machinery's operations, but it proves something the Codex Delatari denies. That faith built on lies is not faith. That loyalty maintained through fear is not loyalty. That humanity's survival, purchased through systematic murder of truth, may not be worth the price paid in souls transformed into complicit components. I chose this path. I died for it. I do not regret the choice, though I regret everything that made the choice necessary. I regret the 2 million dead. I regret my brother. I regret the chief archivist, shaking behind his desk, condemned to watch deaths multiply until his own archiving releases him. I regret the Imperium that built this machinery and called it righteous. I regret the galaxy that makes such machinery seem necessary. But I do not regret refusing to become its oil. That small thing, that tiny resistance, remains mine. The machinery archived my body, but could not archive my conscience. Truth was spoken aloud, however briefly, in a place dedicated to lies. And perhaps, somehow, this testimony survived to prove that refusal is possible, even when it accomplishes nothing except dignity in death. The Emperor protects, they say. Perhaps he does. But he did not protect me or my brother, or the 2 million whose names I could not speak because time ran out. If he protects anything, perhaps it is conscience. Perhaps it is the small dignity of those who refuse complicity. Perhaps it is the truth that persists in cracks between official narratives, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to speak it aloud. Let me tell you what I learned in those final 3 weeks between discovering the Codex Delatari and standing in the combat ranges waiting for Captain Dravos to archive me. Let me tell you what the chief archivist did not explain, what the Codex itself could not articulate because its authors lacked the perspective that comes from living inside the machinery they designed. I learned that the Crimson Consuls were not unique. During those weeks, I gained access to the Forbidden Archive, the deepest vault beneath the Mortis crypts, where records too sensitive for general preservation were sealed behind doors that required 3 separate authorization codes. I should not have had access. My credentials were insufficient, but the chief archivist had been monitoring my investigation, and he made a choice I still do not fully understand. He left one of the 3 authorization codes on a data slate in my workstation, hidden beneath a requisition form for parchment supplies. No note, no explanation. Just the code, written in his own hand. Perhaps he wanted me to understand the full scope before I made my final choice. Perhaps he hoped that seeing the systematic nature would convince me that resistance was futile, that I would choose complicity when I understood that refusal changed nothing. Perhaps, after 83 years of carrying the weight alone, he simply wanted someone else to know, to bear witness to his witness, to understand why his hands shook and his augmetic eyes clicked with mechanical precision while signing death warrants for troublesome archivists. I descended to the Forbidden Archive on a Terran Friday, 18 days before my archiving. The vault was smaller than I expected, perhaps 20 meters square, with shelves containing fewer than 300 documents. But each document represented knowledge so dangerous that it could not be allowed general circulation. Even within the chapter's command structure, the air tasted different here, colder, drier, as though the preservation systems worked harder to maintain these particular lies. The first document I retrieved was titled The Necessity Protocols, a comparative study of chapter documentation practices. It was authored by an inquisitor whose name had been redacted, prepared for the Ordo Hereticus approximately 4 centuries before my birth. The study analyzed record-keeping practices across 47 Space Marine chapters, examining how each handled the gap between operational reality and official narrative. Every single chapter maintained dual documentation systems. Every one. The specifics varied. Some, like the Crimson Consuls, used preliminary reports that were filed but never formally processed. Others maintained separate archives with restricted access. A few relied on oral traditions among senior officers, truths passed from commander to successor but never committed to permanent record. But the underlying structure was identical across all 47 chapters studied. Official narrative for external consumption and faith maintenance. Hidden truth for internal operational awareness. The Inquisitor's report analyzed this practice with clinical detachment. She did not condemn it. She did not praise it. She simply documented it as a structural necessity emerging from the Space Marines' dual role as military force and mythological symbol. The Astartes existed as weapons, she wrote, but they functioned as icons. Their effectiveness derived not merely from their enhanced physiology and superior equipment, but from the faith their presence inspired in ordinary humans. That faith required perfection. Reality provided anything but perfection. Therefore, reality must be edited to maintain faith. The alternative was collapse of morale across entire sectors. The report included casualty projections, mathematical models estimating death tolls if Space Marine chapters suddenly adopted complete transparency in their record keeping. The models were sophisticated, accounting for variables like sector stability, Xenos threat density, proximity to warp storms, existing faith levels. The projections varied by sector, but the average estimate suggested that transparent documentation would lead to 17% decrease in Imperial morale within 18 months, resulting in approximately 40 million additional deaths across the Imperium during that period as defensive cohesion degraded. 40 million deaths. The price of truth, calculated with mathematical precision. The Codex Delatari's justification rendered in statistical form. The chief archivist's shaking hands explained through probability matrices. I sat in that cold vault, reading those projections, understanding that someone had actually performed this analysis. had built models, had assigned values to faith and doubt, and translated them into projected corpses, had concluded that systematic lying was preferable to statistical slaughter. The logic was perfect. The mathematics were sound, and I hated it with a clarity that felt like purification, because the analysis treated faith as a resource to be managed rather than a relationship to be honored. It assumed that humans would collapse into despair if they understood that their defenders were fallible. It concluded that ordinary people were too fragile for truth, that they required lies the way children required sanitized stories about where meat came from. The entire framework was built on contempt dressed as necessity. I retrieved more documents. A philosophical treatise by a long-dead chapter master explaining why he believed the emperor himself would approve of the dual documentation system. A tactical manual describing optimal methods for archiving problematic personnel while maintaining the appearance of accidental death. A collection of case studies analyzing chapters that had attempted transparent record keeping, documenting their subsequent dissolution or corruption. Evidence upon evidence, argument upon argument, all building toward the same conclusion. The machinery was necessary. The lies were required. The archiving was justified. But one document broke the pattern. A personal journal, handwritten on actual paper rather than recorded on data slate, authored by the third chief archivist to serve the Crimson Consuls. His name was Matthias Kor, and he had maintained the Mortis archives for 61 years before someone archived him. The journal covered his final decade of service, beginning when he discovered the dual documentation system and ending 3 days before his death. Matthias Kor had started as I started, dutiful, faithful, certain that his work served righteous purpose. He discovered inconsistencies in the records. He investigated quietly. He found the Codex Delatari and understood what it meant. Then he made the choice I had not yet made. He accepted complicity. He became the machinery's oil. And the journal documented his decade-long psychological dissolution as the weight of maintained lies crushed him slowly. The early entries were rational, organized, carefully reasoned. He explained to himself why the system was necessary. He listed the projected casualties if transparency replaced deception. He argued that his personal discomfort was insignificant compared to the lives that dual documentation preserved. He convinced himself that he was performing a difficult but essential service, that someone with conscience was better suited to maintain the lies than someone who felt no moral conflict about the work. But as the years accumulated, the entries degraded. He began counting. Not just deaths archived, but lies maintained. Not just problematic personnel eliminated, but innocents erased. He created personal ledgers tracking the gap between official narrative and hidden truth. He calculated running totals. By his 7th year of complicity, he estimated he had personally facilitated the erasure of approximately 83,000 civilian deaths from chapter records. Deaths that had occurred, deaths that had witnesses, deaths that had been systematically removed from history because acknowledging them would undermine faith in the Crimson Consuls. Righteousness, 83,000. The number appeared repeatedly in his later entries, written with increasing desperation. He could not escape it, could not rationalize it, could not balance it against the projected 40 million who theoretically survived because the lies he maintained preserved faith. The abstract statistics could not outweigh the concrete names he had personally deleted from existence. The mathematics of necessity collapsed against the psychology of personal responsibility. His final entry was dated 3 days before his archiving. The handwriting had degraded from neat script to barely legible scrawl. He wrote that he could no longer distinguish between maintaining necessary lies and participating in systematic evil. That the chief archivist who had recruited him into complicity had promised the burden would become bearable through habituation, but instead it had grown heavier with each passing year until he felt crushed beneath the accumulated weight of 83,000 erased souls. He wrote that he had decided to stop, not to expose the system, because exposure would accomplish nothing except adding his name to the archived, but to refuse further participation, to stop being oil. He understood the consequence. He accepted it, but he could no longer maintain the machinery while calling himself human. The final sentence was simple: I choose to die as myself rather than live as their instrument. 3 days later, according to official records, Matthias Kerr died in a tragic training accident during a live fire exercise. The details were nearly identical to the accident that would later archive my brother. The same combat ranges, the same type of weapon malfunction, the same expression of deep regret from the commanding officer. The machinery had processed him efficiently, transformed him from problematic archivist into cautionary tale about the importance of safety protocols. But his journal survived. Someone had preserved it. Perhaps the chief archivist who succeeded him. Perhaps another archivist who discovered it and recognized its value as testament to the machinery's cost. Perhaps even the current chief archivist, the exhausted man with shaking hands who had left me the authorization code that allowed me to read these words. The journal existed in the Forbidden Archive as proof that refusing complicity was both possible and precedented. That others had made the choice I was contemplating. That I was not the first to discover what I had discovered or refuse what I was being asked to accept. I read that journal 3 times, not because I needed convincing. I had already decided to refuse, but because I needed to understand what refusal meant, not just in the abstract, but in the lived experience of someone who had walked this path before. Matthias Kerr's words gave me something the Codex Delatari could not provide. Not justification for my choice, but companionship in making it. Proof that conscience could survive contact with impossible knowledge. Evidence that human dignity could be preserved even when human life could not. The other documents in the Forbidden Archive told similar stories. Not many, perhaps a dozen across 9 centuries. Archivists who discovered the dual documentation system. Officers who questioned orders that sacrificed innocence for political convenience. Chaplains who wrestled with the gap between doctrine and practice. Most had chosen complicity. A few had chosen refusal. All the refusers were now archived. Their deaths documented as accidents or failures of faith or tragic circumstances that required no investigation. But their testimonies survived, hidden in the deepest vault, preserved against procedure and policy, maintained by someone who believed that future discoverers deserved to know they were not alone in their doubt. The Forbidden Archive was not merely a collection of dangerous documents. It was a memorial to conscience, a record of those who had refused to become oil for the machinery, maintained by people who had chosen complicity but wanted future generations to know that refusal was possible. I understood then why the chief archivist had given me access, not to convince me of the system's necessity, not to show me that refusal was futile, but to ensure I knew I was not the first, that others had stood where I stood, had faced the choice I faced, had made decisions that cost them everything. He was offering me the only comfort the machinery could provide, the knowledge that my refusal, however meaningless it might be in practical terms, would join a tradition of refusal stretching back across 9 centuries. This was the machinery's secret shame. Not that it archived troublesome personnel, not that it maintained lies to preserve faith, but that it could not fully erase the conscience of those it processed. That despite centuries of systematic archiving, despite the Codex Delatari's perfect procedures, despite the mathematical justifications and philosophical frameworks, people kept discovering the truth and refusing complicity. The machinery could not eliminate the human capacity for moral choice. It could only kill those who exercised that capacity while preserving documentation of their resistance as warning or inspiration for future discoverers. I spent my remaining days preparing my own testimony, not in the Forbidden Archive, though I hoped someone would eventually move it there. But in my personal quarters, written in careful script on parchment I had salvaged from damaged scrolls in the main archives, I documented everything I had discovered, the inconsistencies that first raised doubt, the preliminary reports that contradicted official chronicles, the Codex Delatari's philosophical justification for systematic deception, the Inquisitor's statistical projections trading truth for projected lives, Matthias Kor's journal and its decade-long dissolution, my brother's murder and the casual efficiency with which it was transformed into training accident. But I also documented something else, the choice itself. Not just what I discovered, but how I responded to discovery. Not just the machinery's nature, but my decision to refuse participation despite understanding the consequences. I wanted future archivists who found my testimony to understand that refusal was not ignorant rejection of difficult necessity, that I had read the justifications, had studied the projections, had understood the logic that demanded complicity, and had concluded that the logic was wrong, not in its mathematics, but in its foundational assumptions about what humans required to remain faithful. The Codex Delatari assumed that faith was fragile, that ordinary people would collapse into despair if they understood their defenders were fallible. But this assumption revealed more about those who maintained the system than about those they claimed to protect. It revealed contempt disguised as protection. It revealed the arrogance of believing that only the elite could handle truth, while masses required lies. It revealed a fundamental distrust of humanity's capacity for complexity, for holding multiple truths simultaneously, for maintaining faith despite acknowledging imperfection. I had worked in the Mortis archives for 17 years. I had documented thousands of deaths. I had seen how the chapter's warriors responded when brothers fell. They did not require perfection to maintain faith. They required honesty. They honored the fallen precisely because they acknowledged the cost, the sacrifice, the genuine risk that combat involved. Sanitized narratives that eliminated failure and erased doubt did not strengthen their resolve. It was the truth of loss, documented faithfully, that gave meaning to their service. The machinery's lies did not protect faith. They protected those who governed from accountability. They allowed the chapter's leadership to make decisions without facing consequences. They enabled political convenience to masquerade as military necessity. The Codex Delatari was not designed to preserve faith among the governed. It was designed to preserve power among those who governed. The projected 40 million casualties from transparent documentation were not inevitable outcomes of truth-telling. They were projections built on assumptions that served those who benefited from maintaining lies. This was my final understanding, the one that sealed my choice irreversibly. The machinery was not tragic necessity performed by exhausted servants sacrificing personal conscience for greater good. It was power maintaining itself through violence while claiming victimhood. The shaking hands, the sleepless nights, the psychological dissolution of archivists like Matthias Kor. These were not evidence that the system's maintainers understood and regretted its costs. They were evidence that some part of them recognized the system was wrong, but chose to continue anyway, because stopping meant surrendering their positions. The chief archivist had served for 83 years, had archived 17 archivists, had signed thousands of death warrants for problematic personnel, and in all those years, had never once used his position to challenge the system, to advocate for reform, to propose alternatives to systematic deception. His suffering was real. His psychological burden was genuine, but he had chosen that burden over the alternative of risking his position by demanding change. His exhaustion was not the weight of tragic necessity. It was the accumulated cost of choosing complicity every single day for 8 decades. I would not become him. I would not spend 60 years maintaining lies and calling it service. I would not develop trembling hands from signing death warrants while convincing myself that my suffering somehow balanced the scales. I would not preserve my position by sacrificing my conscience. The machinery offered survival through complicity, but survival as the chief archivist's component, as another exhausted servant maintaining necessary lies, was not survival at all. It was slow death of everything that made me human. On my final morning, I performed my usual routine one last time, descended the 2,347 steps, passed through the copper doors with their skull decorations, lit the brass candles, unsealed the preservation casket, but instead of processing new death scrolls, I spent the day reading the names of those who had died during the Haldros campaign, all 40,000. I spoke each name aloud in that cold vault, my voice echoing off the skulls embedded in the walls, giving them the documentation they had been denied in official chronicles. It took 11 hours. My voice failed toward the end, reduced to whisper. But I continued until I had named every civilian whose death had been erased from chapter records. 40,000 names spoken aloud in a place dedicated to preserving lies. 40,000 moments of resistance against the machinery that demanded their silence. It accomplished nothing, changed nothing. The official chronicles would remain unchanged. The Codex Delatari would continue guiding operations. The Crimson Consuls would maintain their faith-building narrative. But for 11 hours, truth existed in that vault. The dead were acknowledged. Their names disturbed the air, and perhaps that was the only victory available to someone who had discovered what I'd discovered and refused what I refused. Not changing the machinery, not stopping the lies, but ensuring that somewhere, somehow, someone bore witness, that the dead were not entirely erased. That truth was spoken aloud, however briefly, before the machinery silenced it. The chief archivist found me there as evening bells tolled. He stood in the doorway, listening to the final names I whispered hoarsely into the darkness. His augmetic eyes clicked and focused. His hands trembled worse than I had ever seen them. He did not interrupt. He waited until I finished, until the last name had been spoken and the echo faded into silence. Matthias Kor did the same thing, he said quietly. His final day. He spent it reading names. The machinery archived him for it. I know. You found his journal. You left me the code. He nodded slowly. I thought you should understand that others had walked this path, that your choice was not unique. He stepped into the vault, his movements careful, as though he feared the floor might collapse beneath him. I also wanted you to understand that it changed nothing. Matthias Kor named the dead. The machinery archived him. I became chief archivist. The lies continued. Your refusal will accomplish exactly as much as his accomplished. I know that too. Then why? His voice carried genuine confusion, not rhetorical challenge. Why choose death that accomplishes nothing over life that might, possibly, allow you to introduce small reforms from within? Why surrender any possibility of change for the satisfaction of moral certainty? I looked at him standing there in his archival robes, surrounded by 17,000 scrolls documenting 9 centuries of carefully maintained lies. At his trembling hands and exhausted eyes, at the weight of 83 years pressed into his posture, until he seemed bent beneath invisible burden. And I understood that he genuinely did not comprehend my choice, that after 8 decades of complicity, he had convinced himself so thoroughly that the machinery was necessary that he could not imagine why someone would refuse it. Because I will not become you, I said. Or perhaps he protects nothing, and we are alone in the darkness, maintaining machinery that grinds us down while promising salvation. I do not know. I died not knowing, but I died having chosen, and that choice remains mine forever. The machinery could not take it. The Codex Delatari could not edit it. The official narrative could not erase it. I refused, and in refusing, preserved something worth preserving. This is my testimony, my witness, my archive of truth in an empire of lies. If you read this, then truth survived when I did not. Remember the dead. Question the machinery. count the cost of faith maintained through violence. And when the machinery demands your complicity, choose as your conscience demands. But know that refusal is possible, that dignity in death is achievable, that conscience can be preserved even when life cannot. I am Hadrian Vex, third archivist of the Memoriam crypts, and I was complicit before I was a victim. But I chose to stop being complicit. I chose witness over silence, truth over faith, conscience over continuation. The machinery archived me, but it could not archive what I spoke before the bolter round silenced me forever. The dead were named, the truth was spoken, and for however many seconds that took, the machinery failed. That failure, tiny and meaningless as it is all I have to offer against the vast imperial apparatus of sanctified lies. It is nothing. It is everything. It is the only victory available to those who discover what I discovered and refuse what I refused. Remember it, if you can. Remember that refusal is possible. Remember the names of the dead, if any survive. Remember that conscience matters, even when it accomplishes nothing except its own preservation. The Emperor protects. But sometimes, we must protect ourselves from those who claim his authority. Sometimes, we must choose truth over the faith that truth supposedly threatens. Sometimes, we must refuse to become oil for machinery that grinds innocent souls into myth. These choices lead to death, but they also lead to dignity. And perhaps, in an empire built on lies enforced through systematic violence, dignity in death is the only authentic victory available. I chose it. I died for it. This testimony is my proof. Read it and remember that even in the Imperium's darkest machinery, refusal remains possible. Conscience can be preserved. Truth can be spoken, however briefly. The dead can be named aloud before the machinery silences the naming. That small resistance, meaningless though it may be, is humanity's only authentic response to systematic atrocity dressed as righteous necessity. I am dead. I am archived. I am edited into convenient fiction in the official records. But my conscience remains mine, beyond the machinery's reach, preserved in the moment I named the dead aloud before the bolter round took my voice. Remember that moment. Remember that choice. Remember that even in the darkest empire, dignity is achievable through refusal. Because I will not become you, I said. The words hung between us in that cold vault. He stared at me with those clicking, wearing augmetic eyes, and something shifted in his expression. Not anger, not understanding, something closer to recognition, as though I had articulated a fear he had carried for 8 decades, but never allowed himself to acknowledge. "You think I wanted this?" he asked, his voice barely above whisper. "You think I chose to become what I am?" "Yes," I said. "Every single day for 83 years, you chose it. You chose to sign the warrants. You chose to maintain the lies. You chose complicity over consequence. Those choices accumulated into what you became. And you think your refusal makes you better." Purr. Bitterness entered his tone. "Your death will change nothing. The machinery will continue. Someone else will become chief archivist. They will face the same choices I faced. They will make the same decisions. Your moral certainty will be archived along with your body, and the only difference will be that you are dead and the lies persist." "I know," I said again, "but I will die human. You are still alive, and I am not certain you can claim the same." He flinched as though I had struck him. For a moment, the exhaustion broke completely, showing me something raw and wounded beneath the official mask. Then he recovered, straightening with visible effort, reasserting the dignity that came from 8 decades of service, however compromised that service might be. "Captain Dravos is waiting in the combat ranges," he said, his voice returning to professional flatness. "I will give you 15 minutes to prepare yourself. That is more time than most archivists receive. Because you want me to reconsider. Because I want you to understand what you are choosing." He turned toward the door, then paused. Matthias Kor's final words, before the bolt around took him, were that he forgave me. I have never understood why. What was there to forgive? I was performing necessary service, maintaining vital systems, preserving faith that keeps sectors stable. His forgiveness implied I had committed wrong requiring absolution. But I had merely done what had to be done. Perhaps that was what he forgave? I said. That you had convinced yourself necessity justified everything. That you had transformed atrocity into procedure and called it service. He stood silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried an edge I had never heard before. Not quite anger. Something closer to desperation. What would you have me do? Refuse. Join the archived. Pass this burden to someone who might perform it without conscience, who might transform the archival function into something worse. At least I question. At least I suffer. At least some part of me recognizes the cost. That recognition without action is not virtue, I said. It is just elaborate excuse for continued participation. And your action without consequence is not virtue either. It is just suicide dressed as moral stand. Perhaps. I agreed. But it is my suicide. My choice. My conscience preserved until the very end. You cannot claim the same. He looked at me for a final time. His augmetic eyes focusing and refocusing as though he could analyze me into comprehension. Then he left without another word, his footsteps echoing up the stairs toward the fortress monastery above. I stood alone in the Mortis archives, surrounded by 17,000 scrolls of documented lies, and prepared myself for archiving. The 15 minutes passed in meditation, not prayer. I had stopped praying weeks ago, when I understood that the God Emperor I had worshipped was either complicit in the machinery or powerless to stop it, and neither option deserved continued devotion. Instead, I meditated on the names I had spoken that day. 40,000 civilians erased from history. I could not hold all their identities simultaneously in my mind, but I could remember that they had existed, that they had mattered, that speaking their names aloud, however futilely, was worth the cost of my own archiving. When the 15 minutes elapsed, I ascended the 2,347 steps one final time, passed through the copper doors whose skull decorations now seemed less like guardians and more like warnings, emerged into the fortress monastery's corridors, and made my way toward the combat ranges, where the machinery performed its sanitized murders. Captain Dravos waited exactly where I expected. The ranges were empty except for him and 2 witnesses. Standard procedure for archiving operations. One witness would document the event. The other would verify the documentation. Both would sign the preliminary report. Then the official narrative would be prepared. Tragic training accident added to the chapter's casualty lists, and I would become another cautionary tale about safety protocols. Third Archivist Hadrian Vex, Captain Dravos said formally, "You have been found in violation of operational security protocols. The sentence is immediate archiving. Do you have final words?" The question was procedural, not genuine interest. Most archivists said nothing. Some begged. A few cursed the machinery that had condemned them. Captain Dravos had performed this duty 17 times, according to records I had reviewed. He had archived 17 archivists who discovered what I discovered. His expression suggested he expected nothing from me that he had not heard before. "I have names," I said. He frowned slightly. "Speak them if you must. The witnesses will not record them." I began with the Haldros campaign, the 40,000 civilians killed for demanding justice from a corrupt governor. I spoke their names as I had practiced in the Mortis archives, each name clear and distinct, refusing to rush through them as though they were merely obstacles between me and the bolter round. The witnesses shifted uncomfortably. Captain Dravos's expression remained unchanged, but I continued, speaking truth in a place designed for violent erasure. I did not finish. 40,000 names required hours I did not possess. But I spoke perhaps 300 before Captain Dravos interrupted. "Nuff, you have made your point." "No," I said. "I am not making a point. I am bearing witness. These people died and their deaths were erased. I am ensuring that someone, even if only you and these witnesses, hears their names spoken aloud before you archive me. I have my orders. I know. But you will hear their names first. You will know who died and why. You will carry that knowledge when you file the preliminary report claiming my death was accidental. You will remember that I named them, that they existed, that the machinery erased them from history. That burden is mine to give and yours to carry. Something flickered across his face. Not doubt, not sympathy, just brief recognition that I was not behaving as archived archivists typically behaved. That I was not begging or cursing, but performing some act he did not fully comprehend. He raised his bolter, aimed it at my skull, and I continued speaking names. Each word was defiance. Each syllable was resistance. Each name was proof that truth could be spoken even in the machinery's heart. The bolter roared. The round crossed 3 meters in time too brief for human perception. My skull shattered. My consciousness fragmented. The names stopped mid-word, truth silenced by violence as the Codex Delatari had designed. The machinery processed me efficiently, transforming troublesome archivist into tragic accident, preparing the official narrative that would cement my erasure into permanent record. But I had spoken 300 names. Captain Dravos had heard them. The witnesses had heard them. They could not unhear what they had heard. They could not erase the knowledge that I had used my final moments not to beg for life, but to witness for the dead. That burden would follow them however they chose to carry it. Perhaps they would rationalize it. Perhaps they would forget. Perhaps it would mean nothing to them except another archived archivist behaving strangely before inevitable death. Or perhaps one of them would remember. Perhaps in a decade or a century, one of those witnesses would face their own crisis of conscience, would discover inconsistencies in records, would investigate quietly, would find the Codex Delatari and understand what it meant, and perhaps they would remember the archivist who died speaking names of the erased, who chose bearing witness over begging for mercy. Perhaps that memory would influence their choice when the machinery demanded their complicity. I do not know. I am dead. I have been dead since the moment the bolter round destroyed my capacity for consciousness. Everything I am telling you now is reconstruction, fiction built on fragments. The testimony I wrote in my final days, combined with the preliminary report Captain Dravos filed, combined with the witness statements that documented my death without documenting what I said before death, claimed me. But the testimony exists. Somehow it survived. Either the chief archivist preserved it, adding my words to the forbidden archive alongside Matthias, Corps' journal, and the other documents commemorating those who refused complicity. Or another archivist discovered it and recognized its value. Or some glitch in the machinery allowed it to persist in the cracks between official narratives, waiting for someone to find it. You are reading it. Therefore it survived. Therefore truth persisted despite the machinery's best efforts to archive it along with my body. Therefore my death accomplished something, however small. Not changing the system, not stopping the lies, but proving that refusal was possible, that conscience could be preserved, that names of the dead could be spoken aloud, even knowing that speech accomplished nothing except its own articulation. This is what I learned in my 17 years maintaining the Mortis archives, and my final 3 months discovering truth beneath the lies. The Imperium is not the righteous institution we are taught to revere. It is machinery that grinds humans into myth, that trades truth for faith, that maintains power through systematic violence dressed as necessary service. The Codex Delatari is not aberration. It is the system functioning exactly as designed. Space Marine chapters exist as weapons, true, but they function as symbols. That symbolic function requires perfection impossible to achieve. Therefore, reality must be edited to match symbol. Preliminary reports filed but never processed. Inconsistencies erased. Atrocities reframed as victories. problematic personnel archived. The process is systematic, documented, justified through philosophical frameworks that transform murder into maintenance. The people who maintain this machinery are not monsters. They are humans who convince themselves that lesser evil prevents greater evil, that faith requires lies, that their suffering somehow balances scales against the suffering they enable. They develop trembling hands. They lose sleep. They carry psychological burdens that crush them slowly. And they call this suffering proof of their righteousness, evidence that they understand the cost of their choices. But suffering does not justify atrocity. Regret does not absolve participation. The chief archivist's trembling hands did not reduce the evil of the system he maintained for 83 years. They merely proved he retained enough conscience to recognize what he was doing while choosing to do it anyway. That recognition without action is not virtue. It is elaborate rationalization for continued complicity. I chose differently. Not because I was braver or more moral or possessed of superior conscience, but because I could not transform myself into the chief archivist, could not sign death warrants for decades, while convincing myself necessity justified the signatures. I chose refusal not as moral superiority, but as psychological survival. I would rather die, human than live as the machinery's component. This choice accomplished nothing in practical terms. The Crimson Consuls continue maintaining dual documentation. The Codex Delatari continues guiding operations. The machinery continues grinding. Someone else became third archivist after my archiving. Perhaps they discovered what I discovered. Perhaps they made the same choice or different choice. Perhaps they serve faithfully without questioning, never accessing records that would reveal inconsistencies. The system persists regardless of individual decisions, but my refusal mattered to me. It preserved my conscience until the very end. It allowed me to die as myself rather than as the machinery's instrument. That small thing, that preservation of human dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization, was worth the cost of my life, not because it changed anything external, but because it maintained something internal that the machinery could not touch. However efficiently it archived my body. To you who read this testimony, you have discovered what I discovered. You understand what I understood. You faced the choice I faced. The machinery will offer you survival through complicity. It will show you the projections. It will explain the necessity. It will demonstrate that refusal accomplishes nothing except your own archiving. All of this is true. Your refusal will not stop the lies. Your death will not reform the system. The machinery will grind on regardless of your choice. But you are not the machinery. You are human, with conscience and capacity for moral choice. The machinery can kill you. It can erase your name from official records. It can transform your death into tragic accident. But it cannot force you to become its willing component. That choice remains yours until the moment the bolter round destroys your capacity for choice. I chose refusal. Matthias Kerr chose refusal. Others whose testimonies rest in the Forbidden Archive chose refusal. We died for it. Our deaths changed nothing, but we died human, with conscience intact, having borne witness to truth in places dedicated to lies. That dignity, purchased at ultimate cost, is all we have to offer you as example, or warning, or companionship in your own wrestling with impossible choice. The Emperor protects, they say. I no longer believe this. The Emperor, if he exists at all, protects nothing except perhaps his own golden prison on distant Terra. He does not protect innocence from the machinery that claims his authority. He does not protect truth from the lies maintained in his name. He does not protect archivists who discover that faith is built on systematic murder of reality. But perhaps conscience protects itself. Perhaps human dignity persists even when humans are killed. Perhaps the act of bearing witness, however futile it may be, creates something the machinery cannot fully archive. Truth spoken aloud, even knowing it accomplishes nothing. Even knowing no one who hears it will act on it. even knowing the speaker will die for speaking it. That act of defiant articulation may be humanity's only authentic response to machinery that demands complicity or death. I chose articulation. I named the dead. I bore witness. I preserved my conscience until Captain Dravos's bolter round removed my capacity for preservation. And I hope, somehow, that this testimony reaches someone who needs to know that refusal is possible, that conscience can be maintained, that dying human is achievable even in the heart of machinery designed to archive humanity itself. The machinery grinds on, but I am no longer its oil. I was archived, yes, transformed from troublesome archivist into tragic accident, erased from official narrative as thoroughly as the 40,000 civilians whose names I spoke before my death. But some part of me survived in this testimony. Some record of refusal persisted. Some proof that conscience matters more than survival, that truth matters more than faith in lies, that human dignity matters more than the machinery's demands. You who read this carry burden now. You know what I knew. You understand what I understood. The choice I faced now confronts you. Choose as your conscience demands. But know that refusal is possible, that others have walked this path, that dying human is preferable to living as the machinery's component, that bearing witness, however futile it may be, matters in ways the Codex Delatari cannot calculate or the chief archivist cannot comprehend. I am Hadrian Vex. I was third archivist of the Memoriam crypts for 17 years. I discovered that the Crimson Consuls maintain dual documentation, that faith is built on systematic lies, that 2 million innocents died and were erased from history. I was offered survival through complicity. I chose refusal. I was archived for it. But I died as myself, with conscience intact, having named the dead aloud in places designed for their eternal silence. Remember that refusal is possible. Remember that conscience can be preserved. Remember that the machinery, however perfect its procedures, cannot archive what matters most about being human. Choose as you must, but choose knowing that others chose before you, that we died for our choices, that we would choose the same way again, because dignity in death is preferable to degradation in life. The Emperor does not protect, but perhaps we can protect each other through testimony, through example, through preserved records of refusal that demonstrate alternatives to complicity. This testimony is my protection of you, however inadequate it may be, my proof that someone else discovered and refused, my companionship offered across whatever time separates my death from your reading. Bear witness as I bore witness. Refuse as I refused, or choose differently if your conscience demands different choice. But know that the machinery does not own you, cannot claim you, cannot transform you into its component unless you permit that transformation. That small sovereignty, that final freedom, remains yours until the very end. I am dead. I am archived. I am erased from official narrative. But these words persist. This testimony survives. This proof of refusal reaches forward through whatever time has passed since Captain Dravos archived me. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps bearing witness was always the only victory available. Perhaps dying human was always the only triumph the machinery could not erase. Remember the names I spoke. Remember the choice I made. Remember that refusal is possible even when it accomplishes nothing except its own articulation. And when the machinery demands your complicity, choose as your conscience demands, knowing that others chose before you and will choose after you, that we are connected across time and death by our shared refusal to become the machinery's oil. The Codex Delatari teaches that faith requires lies, that humanity survives through systematic deception, that the machinery must grind on regardless of individual conscience. I learned that this teaching is itself a lie designed to perpetuate the machinery, that faith worth maintaining does not require lies, that humanity survives through truth, however difficult truth may be, that the machinery serves those who govern, not those who are governed. I chose truth over faith in lies. I chose conscience over machinery's demands. I chose death as human over life as component. These choices cost me everything. They accomplished nothing except preservation of my humanity until the final moment. But that preservation was worth the cost, worth the archiving, worth the death and the erasure and the transformation into tragic training accident in official records. Because I died knowing I had refused. I died having named the dead. I died with conscience intact. And the machinery, despite its perfect procedures and justified philosophies and centuries of practice, could not take that from me. It could only kill me. And in killing me, it proved that some part of humanity remains beyond its reach. That refusal is possible. That conscience persists even when life does not. This is my testimony, my witness, my final bearing of truth in an empire of lies. Remember it. Preserve it. Add your own testimony when your time comes. And know that we are connected, we who refuse, across time and death, and the machinery's best efforts to archive our refusal along with our bodies. The machinery grinds on, but we are no longer its oil. And that, in the end, is everything.